Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com, Weiss Advice here on YouTube. I want to talk about mixing from a producer perspective. So I have been doing this for a long time. I've talked to many people about the mixing process. I've found that producers, particularly people who are creating an electronic art form or something that's electronically originated, so anything from hip-hop to EDM, tend to struggle a little bit with mixing at first. And the reason is because they've never confronted the idea, what am I even really trying to do? I think there's some nebulous concept about what a good mix should be. It should be punchy and clear and all that kind of stuff, but there's never really like a solid moment where the producer is saying, oh, this is the goal that I'm trying to accomplish. So what is the mixing process? Technically, the mixing process is just taking multi-tracks and summing them down to a single format, which is typically a stereo 2-track. So lots of tracks, now 2 tracks. We've mixed them together. But that's not really what we're doing. What we're really doing is refining the production process. We're making sure that every element that's been placed in our production is serving the purpose it's supposed to serve to the best of its ability. As long as we're thinking about it in that framework, mixing is actually not that challenging. Another way of putting it is, what is the intention of the record we are trying to produce? Okay, let's work toward that intention. As long as we've decided what good is, we know how to determine whether or not the mix we've made is good. But if we never stop to think about that, we never really know. So I'm going to pop on in here. This is a beat that I produced. Whether or not it's good or not as a production, that's fairly unimportant. What's going to be important is how I choose to present things in the decision-making process I make in the mix stage. So it's a beat, but is it just a beat? No, there's an intention behind it. I think sometimes we start making a beat by just finding something that intrigues us, it gets the ball rolling, and we start going from there. But a lot of the times, I don't think that we stop to go, well, what is this beat really doing? Right? Once we get to a certain point in the production process, we need to start asking ourselves, what is the context of this record? Is it going to be a record people are going to dance to? Is it going to be something people are going to listen to on headphones while riding the subway? Is this a record that people play in the car and get all in their feels to? What is the purpose of this record, right? If we start to think about intention, then we can start to go with what's going to get us there. So the real main crux of mixing is actually, what even is the point? It's asking the question and then answering that question in terms of what we have. So I would say for this beat, there's a strong R&B kind of a chord structure. It kind of has like sort of like the sexy major minor feel. It's supposed to be a little romantic. There's definitely like kind of a 90s vibe going on here. So now what I want to do in the mix process is double down on those ideas. Now, in terms of what we're doing during the mix process, I kind of divide my entire thought into 2 categories. One is going to be balancing, which is how one sound relates to all of the other sounds in the production. The other is going to be sound design, which is how the sound relates to itself. Is the sound complete? Could it be something else? Sound design is almost more of a production decision than a mix decision, but the lines get very blurry. So I want to start with this main sound. Everything in this beat is revolving around this Rhodes sound. So I have to ask myself, is this Rhodes sound compelling? Is it sexy? Does it have a vibe that reminds me of like early 90s records? And if I'm being honest with myself, I would say no. It has certain things that I like, but it's really just a good Rhodes sound. It doesn't have its own personality necessarily. It just sounds like a Rhodes, which, okay, cool. But can we make it something more than that? Can we bring home the ideas of this being 90s R&B, sexy, romantic? So I would say the first thing is it's too dry. This is a sound design idea. I'm going to start with reverb here because reverb can oftentimes be used in order to make something more romantic feeling. So let's put on some reverb and see where this goes. Right, a million times better right off the bat. And then what reverb we choose and all of those kinds of things is an even further nuanced refinement of the idea of what we're doing, right? So why this reverb? Well, because it gave me the right kind of sparkle and modulation and things like that that I was looking for to create a romantic texture. I think there are many reverbs that could have worked. This happens to be one that I like. In fact, actually, I'm using, if you get this reverb, it comes with my presets. So I'm using my own preset that comes stock with the reverb with some modification. Now, the next question is, does it sound 90s? And I would say no. A lot of early 90s is going to be early digital or tape, and this to me does not sound that way. So I want to do something that's going to make it feel more like it's coming off of a sampler or more like it's going through something that's slightly lo-fiing the sound here. So I'm going to use Decimort to then take this sound and almost treat it like a sample. So we get some nice saturation, we roll off some top end, it starts to sound warmer, it starts to sound like it's got a little bit of grit to it, but now it's too dark. This is not the sound that I want yet. So the next couple of things are all about refining this primary sound, getting it to sound exactly the way I want it to sound, adding top end here, taking out a little bit of lows, refining it with some more saturation, redefining the lows, redefining the highs. We also got a little loud, so we're going to take the level down. And then there's just some like crud that showed up from Decimort here in the very, very super trebly frequencies that I'm going to take out. So this is more of a technical thing, right? I don't want somebody who's got good hearing in the very, very upper range to be getting blasted with like 17K. It's not going to be a pleasing sound. Almost the way I like. The only thing is that I feel like it's leaning a little right heavy. This is my primary sound, so I want to make it feel like it's a little more balanced in the stereo image. So I'm going to take the right side down a little bit, and I'm going to turn the left side up a whole bunch. And that's going to give me my final sound. So before. Now, that's the main sound in the record, so everything else now can start to conform and relate to that. Now, in terms of what we do during the mix, although I did a whole bunch of sound design stuff right now, I want to point out that for the most part, that's almost more production decision than it is even mix decision. I'm just using the mix phase as a chance to capitalize on the opportunity and create a more compelling main sound. Everything else now is going to relate to that sound. So the question is, what are our ingredients here? What are our tools for getting the other sounds to relate, right? We have all sorts of tools. We have EQ, we have compression, we have reverb, we have delay, we have all sorts of things. But the most powerful and most important one is going to be level. Simply getting the balances right, the proportion of kick drum, the proportion of snare, the proportion of Rhodes, the proportion of bass is going to be the vast majority of the actual mix process. Now, a lot of the times we feel like we have to do all sorts of crazy things. Oh, you can use a multi-band compressor and a phase modulator and a backwards somersault left-handed Suzuki EQ and all kinds of stuff. But I would consider this. When we're EQing a signal, let's say we put on a high shelf and boost 4 dB at, say, 6K, something like that. That means that we're effectively adding 4 dB of level, but only specifically at a portion of the sound, just the 4K and up stuff. Let's consider a compressor now. If we're compressing something, what we're saying is we're going to attenuate the sound. We're going to turn the level down, but only when the level gets to a certain loudness. So again, only a portion of the sound gets affected. So whether we're using EQ or compression, what we're really doing is adjusting level, but only over specific portions of the sound. What happens when we adjust level? Well, when we adjust level, we're adjusting level over the entire sound, 100% of it, instead of EQ, which is just a fraction, or compression, which is just a fraction. So what does that really mean? It means that level is actually the more powerful tool. We're doing more of an effect by adjusting level than we are by doing compression or EQ. Compression and EQ is really a refinement of level. So our most important decision making, the most powerful tool, the thing that will have the biggest impact on the sound is actually just the volume. As simple as that seems, but that gets vastly overlooked. So when we're mixing, what I like to do is bring in the main sound, the thing that everybody is going to be listening to, and mute everything else, and then start pulling things in terms of what I deem as important. So from my perspective here, the next most important thing is going to be this backbeat, this drum break. So let's balance the drum break against the level. Let's balance the drum break against the Rhodes. So I kind of like it hiding a little bit. I think, well, let's actually turn the Rhodes down ever so slightly too. But I really only want the drum break to kind of stick out at the loudest points of it, so it kind of creates a dynamic within itself. All right, let's talk about this snare. This snare has a very 90s texture to me. It reminds me of like late 90s, kind of like those gritty kind of SP12 snares and things like that. I like that, but it also has a harshness to it. So I think that if it's too loud, it's going to take away from the romantic sensibility. It's going to become too head noddy, and that's not what I'm going for here. So I think I need to turn this snare down in order to get the feel to be right. Not a major adjustment, right? We don't need to completely reinvent it here, but just a little down to sort of smooth it out. And here, again, because it's a more romantic feel that we're going for, pulling the drums down is probably going to be a trend. I wouldn't be surprised if we end up pulling the kick drum down as well. Now, the snare itself, if we solo it real quick, it has a little bit more low end than I think we need, right? So we can refine the level of the snare a little bit more by tightening up the lows and creating a snare that's in a slightly more narrow place. This will leave more space for the kick and the bass below it, and we'll just tighten up the sound overall. I also like the little bit of air and reverb that's on the snare, but I don't think it's enough for like a 90s R&B kind of feel. So we're probably going to want to do some sound design and put a little bit of reverb on there as well. So let's start by just pulling out a little bit of the very, very low end. And you'll notice that my corner frequency here is like 130 hertz. So all I'm really doing is tightening the bass. It's not like I'm completely emaciating the low end of the snare. I still want it to feel like a snare. I just want it to be a little bit tighter. Now with the reverb on the snare, normally I like a tighter reverb, but in this particular case, I feel like having a bigger reverb is going to make it more R&B, and having less reverb keeps it a little bit more hip hop. So the question is, where exactly in that area do I want to find myself? I think that I could maybe damp the high end a little bit more and see how that feels. I like that. To me, it's like it's a dark reverb with a little bit of brightness up front, like a very kind of plate-ish type of sound. And to me, that feels like a nice blend of giving it that kind of like early 90s, slightly too much reverb feel, but at the same time leaving a lot of space for, say, vocals, not making it overly bright, keeping it a little more on the sultry side. So, that's a very subjective decision. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong here. I'm just saying what feels sexier or sultrier, feels like it fits the vibe that I'm going for best. It's a subjective decision. I felt like that was the right spot. That amount of high-end damping. Now, that can also apply to things like how long the decay is, how much low-end is in there. All of those things become very subjective decisions, but as long as I have that barometer, as long as I have that idea of like, this is the vibe I'm trying to go for, then I can at least determine, is that saying that to me? Maybe somebody else might not think so, but at least I can be saying to myself, okay, yeah, that feels romantic to me. And if it feels romantic to me, chances are it will feel romantic to other people, but it's going to fall into a very large ambiguous category, and that's okay. Let's pull in the kick here. So again, I think that the kick is a little bit too loud. Now, I do like a big kick even in more romantic songs. I think that heavy bass is actually really helpful for that kind of stuff. That's just the way I interpret it. But not everybody necessarily agrees. So again, it's really up to you. I would say this is a little bit too much though. This is a little too boom bappy for me. So I want the kick to just really articulate the rhythm and provide that physical low end, but without actually like pushing the speaker over. And I think that's about the right area. Now, do I know for sure? Not necessarily. As I start introducing other elements, the way that every other element feels is going to change. So I might have to come back to this kick and make some adjustments once I bring in the bass. In fact, let's bring in the bass. Let's see what happens here. Personally, I feel like the kick level is about right, but I do lose a little of the articulation. So what I'm thinking is maybe I keep the level the same, but I add just a little bit of mid-range so we get a little bit more definition on the kick drum once the bass is actually in. Now, that kick feels really pillowy once that sub is in. I think because of the smooth nature of this, I actually like that. If this was supposed to be more of like a head nod kind of a record, I would want to make space for the kick in the sub bass, doing some kind of like a fancy ducking thing or some additional EQ or something like that. But frankly, I don't think that we need that. I think having a slightly masked, slightly pillowy kick is actually okay. And this is why having that barometer is so important. This is one of those places where if I'm just going off of like some preconceived ambiguous notion of what makes a good mix, I'd probably end up carving up the bass more than I need to in order to express what I'm trying to express. But here, because I have a focal point, I can actually say, oh, this is one place where I can be a little technically incorrect, and it's probably going to be better for the feel of the record. So let's bring that back in. Now, when we get to the verse here, the bass starts to stand on its own a little bit. I decided for the verse arrangement to take the Rhodes out, and we end up with this. Which is okay, but I feel like because the bass is the only thing giving us any kind of melodic energy, it might be good to get the bass to stand up out of the subs. Right now, this bass is sitting very, very low. You would hear this kind of bass in certain styles of club music, and you hear this style of bass a lot in like reggaeton. It works really well in those areas, specifically because a lot of the time the kicks have a lot of mid-range, and so really all you need from the bass is sub. But here, the sub is now providing melody. Because it has melody, we need something that's going to give us those notes a little bit more. This is going to allow for whoever's singing to create a top line more easily. So I'm going to pull up this Mixwave VLC. This is going to give us some saturation. Saturation is a really good tool for making low frequency things stand out. It's actually very good for making anything stand out, but particularly low frequency stuff. So a little bit of saturation as well as some refinement of the EQ. So I'm doing a low boost as well as a low cut. What ultimately I am doing here is not dissimilar to what's sometimes called the Pultec trick, where I'm boosting and attenuating lows, except for I'm doing it in reverse. I'm giving myself a little bit more of the primary bass range, which is like the note of the bass, you know, maybe that 100 to 200 hertz area, and I'm getting some of the sub stuff a little bit out of the way. So I'm shifting the energy of the bass upward into a slightly higher range so that the ear can pick up the bass notes. Now, this is kind of a tricky and more sophisticated mix technique. I could simply go over here and grab an EQ and go, okay, I want to hear more of the note of the bass. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I would say the simpler solution is usually the better. In this particular case, having been mixing for over 20 years, I'm deciding to go for something that's also going to do a little sound design work and add some character to the bass as well. So let's bring that in. Without. Little dark, little flat, with. Little less dark, little less flat. Now, is it bright enough? Do we have enough of the note? I don't think so. So I think I'm going to add a little bit of EQ in conjunction with that as well. And now I have a melodic component. Now, it's really important to point out that when the arrangement changes, our mix might change. So I can't just say this is the way the bass should sound. I might also need to go over to where the Rhodes is playing and say, hey, does the bass sound good where the Rhodes is playing? And what I'm hearing is that it's actually changing. So because of that, I don't think I want this EQ where the bass is not the dominant element. What I want to do is do something called automation. Automation allows me to control when something is occurring. So while I have the Rhodes in, I don't want this EQ to exist, so I'm going to have it in bypass. But once we get to the verses where the bass is driving things, I want the EQ to turn on. So I'm going to automate it on for just the verse. So by using automation, this is going to give me the best of both worlds. I can have the darker, huskier bass where the Rhodes is taking up the low end, so there's plenty of space and it's providing just a cushion. It's doing exactly what it needs to do. But then when the arrangement changes, the bass becomes a little bit brighter, while it gains a little bit more of its fundamental note in that 100 to 200 hertz range and becomes a little bit more dominant, fills up a little more space, gives a little bit more of the note. We get the best of both worlds. Cool. Let's pull in some more of these elements here. Let's pull in this roll. I think that roll sounds perfect the way it is. I don't feel like I need to change anything about it. I don't even think I need to change the level. Sometimes one of the most important things about mixing is remembering that you don't have to change everything. Not everything needs to be treated. Not everything needs to be adjusted. Sometimes things are just perfect the way they are. And ideally, if we're picking the exact sounds that we want, we do more of this. Better mixes tend to have less processing because it means that the fundamental sounds that we've picked are closer to what the end results need to be. So let's go through the rest of this. Let's pull in this bass top guitar. To me, this is supposed to be just something that separates the first part of the verse from the second part of the verse. We don't really need a lot of it. I think I'm going to turn it down a little bit, and I think I'm also going to push it off to the side. I think I can kind of push it off to the left a little bit, so it's kind of more of just an ear candy thing happening. With panning, there's really two purposes for panning. One thing that we use panning for is to create a soundscape. We want to have a record that has width to it and depth to it so that it feels three-dimensional. Panning is very important. We usually want something to define the extreme left and right, although not always, and that's going to give us a bigger sound. We can also use panning to help with importance. So our important stuff we typically want in the center, right? Center is usually the focus, is usually what's prominent, it's what's going to translate across different systems better. When we push things out of the center, what we're saying is this is less important. We're making more space for what is important by taking something that's less important and pushing it a little out of the way. This is an example of that. This element is really not that important to the arrangement of the record. It's just helping to provide a little bit of lift between the verse A and verse B sections, and that's really it. Let's bring in these cymbals. I mean, that sounds really good. The cymbal feels a little dark, so maybe a little bit of extra highs might be good, but I'm not sure because it kind of is supposed to have a dark, moody feel. I think we're getting that energy, and this might not be a good move, actually. I like it. I think that it works. I think the brightness is more useful to making a bigger sound, but I think it could go either way. And you know what? You might disagree with me. And if you do, say so in the comments section, because I don't always get this stuff right. It becomes a very narrow, subjective decision in terms of what's truly better. Do we like the cymbals darker? Or brighter? Personally, my gut feeling, which I think is the most important thing, sometimes we can over logic things. My gut feeling is to say, actually, the brighter symbol, even though it works against the logic of going for something a little more sultry, the bright symbol sounds better. And it's probably because there's not a lot of stuff happening in the top range. So having something there provides the ear with a more satisfying sound. So we're going to go with that. This top string here that I've got going on. I'm not in love with it, to be honest. I might redo it because to me it's forcing too much of a melody. But let's roll with it for now. I would say it's a little mid-rangey. I'm going to pull out some of the mids, a little 2K down. And then we're going to use a chorusing effect to make it sound kind of more like old school strings. So it's a little grungy, it's a little weird, and I think I'm going to use an imager to stretch it out a little bit more. So I'm going to push it out way to the sides to get that really wide image, maybe pull the gain down a little to compensate. So we have this hyper wide string thing happening, and I don't mind if it loses a little focus in the center because I don't want it to push the melody too much. It's really just supposed to fill out the arrangement to say, hi, this is the hook section. So now, as we're doing this, I should also mention, and I did kind of imply this before, but I want to mention, we're working from the most important things to the least important things. I find that that is generally a good rule of thumb. Get the most important thing to sound right, that was the Rhodes. Get the next most important thing to sound right in relative to the things that are more important, right? So that's the drums, we get that to sound right relative to the Rhodes, and then we continue down the line. Things that are less and less and less important come later and later and later. The string is less important than everything that we've done so far, except for maybe the rolls and cymbals, but maybe not. And then we've gotten down to the very least important thing here, which is going to be this weird vocal chop. Why do I even have that? I have that because I want to add in something that is unique, something that sounds like something people haven't heard before. So I do think it's too big. I'm going to band limit it, meaning I'm going to take out all the lows and a lot of the highs and just focus it on the mid-range. I'm going to tuck it down a little bit because I really don't think we need to have a lot of it. And I'm going to take the same reverb from the Rhodes and I'm going to place it... Oops, that's not the reverb. The same reverb from the Rhodes, I'm going to place it on the chop as well. In fact, I'm actually going to turn the reverb up. I'm going to make some adjustments. I'm going to take the pre-delay all the way off, and I'm going to turn the reverb up on this sound. And what that's going to do is it's going to make the sound feel like it's further away, but in the same space. Why have that sound at all? Well, it adds a personality element to the record. It also gives me an element that I can push way in the background so that I can have a nice contrast between the things that are supposed to sound forward and the things that are supposed to sound far away. So we have wide imaging, we have far imaging. This creates a three-dimensional space for the record to exist in, its own little world here. And that is one of the things that we get to do when we're mixing. Now, the very, very last thing I want to do here is start ironing out some of the transitions. Again, mixing is a chance to refine the production. So if the production includes transitioning from the verse to the chorus, which gets overlooked very, very frequently, I want something that's going to allow the listener to get excited that the chorus is about to happen, build a little anticipation. Now, I have some of that here. I have this roll that kind of carries one section into the next. Right, so we're not entirely without some kind of a transition sound, but I think it would be more interesting if we also took the end of the line of the Rhodes here, and I originally had it as a string sample, so I have it reading as strings. But if I go over to other and I reverse this sound, now I have a little transition reverse. And let's hear how that feels. I like it. I think I'm going to put in a little fade right at the front, just so the very entrance is smoother. But I might also copy this and bring it on over here to the very beginning of the record as well, so that the record actually starts like this. That's a much more interesting start than just kind of cold entering with the Rhodes part. So to me, this is the majority of the mix. Now, there is also something to be said for the mix bus, which is the entirety of the mix coming together. Here is where you probably want to be doing the least amount of work, because this is affecting everything, but it is an important part of the process. Now, because I want this to sound kind of like an early 90s thing, I've decided I'm going to put a tape emulator on the mix bus. It's going to change the frequency response of everything a little bit. So you can hear that it pulls the upper mids forward a little bit. There's a slight saturation tone and kind of rounding of things that's pulling everything and gluing everything ever so slightly. But in truth, this is not doing that much. It's probably the subtlest out of everything that I've done here, and it's just meant to kind of bring it home. So I'm refining, and getting down to the very tiniest detail. Now, I will say that there are a few things that I've done in this video that are a little bit more advanced than basic levels, EQ, compression kind of stuff. That's simply because I've done this a lot. There is something to be said for practice and experiencing certain sounds. I've also done a lot of things that are kind of more along the lines of production. The things that I'm doing with some of the reverbs and distortions and stuff like that are almost more production decisions than mix decisions. Again, that's where the lines get blurry between production and mixing. If you want to really develop your skills as a mixer specifically, I highly recommend joining my website, weissadvice.com. There is all sorts of archived tutorials on every subject, whether it's compression, EQ, reverb, saturation, distortion. It goes really in depth into the very specifics. So like how we're choosing a specific reverb, why we're damping the high end, what the pre-delay means, all of those kind of nuancy things that are very particular to mixing. And in addition to that, I also have a guide called the Beginner's Guide, which gives you basic recording techniques as well as basic mixing techniques involving how to conceptualize level. There's another tutorial in there called Mixing with Emotion that basically takes the ideas that I've described here and really connects the dots to relate sound to emotion and feel, which I also feel as a mix engineer is really the most important thing to be able to do. So that's going really, really in depth. That's weisadvice.com. The link will be in the description below. In addition to all of that stuff, you also get access to the Discord, where you can communicate with me and other members directly. And we do weekly webinars where we all hop on. Right now we're using Zoom. We might switch over to SessionWire or something like that, but we all hop on some kind of peer-to-peer platform with video and audio, and we go over lessons in real time. You can ask questions. We sometimes use members' mixes and records that they're working on. So I highly, highly recommend joining Weiss Advice if you want to get serious about mixing. But if not, you can always hang here on the YouTube channel by hitting that subscribe button, where you are going to get plenty of free information as well. So wherever you're at with it, I've got something for you. So if you dig this video, hit that subscribe button. If you want to catch more videos like this, wait, hold on, doing it wrong. If you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, be sure to hit subscribe. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.